Well, my next guest says the pace of change in Iranian society made this uprising inevitable. The Tony Blair Institute for Global Change has just released a report on attitudes in Iran, and one of the report's authors and Iran analyst, Kasra Aarabi, joins us now to discuss in more detail. Thank you for being with us, Kasra. And in this report, you say that these latest protests are part of a wider movement that began back in 2017. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so anti-regime dissent in Iran has been visible for years. But unfortunately, the West was completely blindsided to this because it was exclusively focused on the 2015 nuclear agreement. And after the US withdrawal, it was viewing Iran through the lens of Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA and the reimposition of sanctions, despite the fact that these protests, this initial trend which began in 2017, this trend of unrest that was explicitly anti-regime, not calling for reform. This first trend started when the US was still part of the nuclear agreement and 11 months before sanctions were reimposed. Look, dissent in Iran, anti-regime dissent in Iran, isn't being driven by the US withdrawal from the deal or the reimposition of sanctions. It's being driven by the gap between the regime, a theocratic, hardline Islamist regime, and the Iranian people, who are, as according to this data and this evidence that we have, one of the most secular and liberal societies in the entire region.
And there is a lot of confusion in the West, isn't there? People trying to figure out what exactly the Iranian people want when they take to the streets. Is it an end to compulsory hijab, because that was what sparked this initial round of protests, or whether it is a real drive for regime change? Why has there been that confusion, do you think?
Well, unfortunately, the West has been misled by this hardliner reformist dichotomy that's been present for decades. Look, the Islamic Republic cannot be reformed. For 30 years, the so-called reformist movement has failed. It was a lie. The Iranian people since 2017 have been saying this openly. The demands of the Iranian people are clear. They are calling for the downfall of the Islamic Republic in its entirety. And the data that we've published today supports that. First of all, these protests are about so much more than the compulsory hijab. But anti-compulsory hijab sentiment cuts across every single demographic in Iran, including the gender demographic. 71% of men and 74% of women oppose the compulsory hijab. Now, here's the important point. 84% of Iranians who oppose the compulsory hijab also want regime change. That gives you the insight as to what's driving these protests. It's not just about the compulsory hijab. The compulsory hijab is a key ideological pillar of the regime, like anti-Semitism, like anti-Americanism. It represents this hardline Islamist ideology. It's the most visible manifestation of that. Iranian women bravely taking off the compulsory hijab and challenging the regime. This has become a symbol of anti-regime sentiment. And really, as I said, the data supports that. We know from the data that what we're seeing in Iran today, this movement, is secular, fundamentally secular in nature. Around 76% of Iranians who want regime change also find religion unimportant in their lives. Iran's society has undergone a significant secular shift, and Iranians want to live under a democratic, secular, liberal regime, a liberal state, which is impossible under this regime.
Right, and it's very interesting. You talk about in the report, and you refer to surveys that were carried out in Iran between 2020 and 2022, and they show a huge change in attitudes and the liberalisation of society that you just spoke about. How do you explain that in a society that is so cut off from the world? The regime regularly switches off the internet. There is a lot of control on the media and what people can see from the outside world. Where does that come from?
Look, the regime is a theocratic, hardline Islamist regime that has sought to cut off Iranians from the outside world. But Iranians still find ways to remain connected. The internet being one of the most important factors here, despite the fact that the regime is imposing internet blackouts. the Iranian people are finding ways to connect themselves to the outside world. Let's not also forget, there's a huge Iranian diaspora community. Between 8 to 11 million Iranians live outside of Iran. A huge, significant chunk of that population has been forced to flee. Iranians remain well connected, but also, look, the liberalization and secularization of Iranian society has been gradual. It started in the early 1990s, and today it's reached unprecedented levels. It is the consequence of hardline Islamist policies enforced by the regime violently on the Iranian people. What the effect that has had is it's not only led to anti-regime dissent, but it's secularized people by default. People are abandoning religion. They no longer consider religion important in their lives. So this isn't just opposition to the Islamic Republic. It reflects a wider shift in Iranian society. The Iranian people want to live under a secular, liberal state. That is impossible under the Islamic Republic. The stats show that 84% of Iranians who are anti-compulsory hijab want to live under a secular state.
Yeah, it's a fascinating report, and I urge everyone to read it. Kasra Aarabi at the Tony Blair Institute. Thank you very much indeed.